History is filled with inventions that changed the world. The telephone, the airplane, the internet. But what if some of the most revolutionary inventions in human history never made it into the world at all? Not because they failed, not because they were impossible, but because they vanished. Scattered across different decades, in different countries, and built by inventors with very different backgrounds, there are stories of machines that seemed to do the impossible. Engines that ran without fuel, cars that moved without gasoline, technologies that could have eliminated pollution, transformed medicine, or made energy nearly free. And yet, each of these inventions followed a strangely similar path. At first, there was excitement, demonstrations, curious investors, scientists who came to watch and verify what they were seeing. For a brief moment, it looked like the future had arrived early. Then something happened. Funding disappeared, patents were challenged, laboratories were shut down, prototypes vanished, and in some cases the inventors themselves met sudden and unexplained ends. Official explanations always sounded reasonable. Technical limitations, financial problems, lack of demand, scientific errors. But when you place these stories side by side, a different pattern begins to appear. A pattern where the most disruptive technologies do not fail naturally. Instead, they are quietly removed before they can change the balance of power. What would happen if a car could run on nothing but water? What would happen if electricity could be transmitted freely through the air, anywhere on Earth, without wires? What would happen if a battery could last 50 years? Or if pollution could be eliminated entirely by a single machine? For the industries built on oil, energy grids, replacement products, and constant consumption, such inventions would not simply be breakthroughs. They would be threats. Tonight we are going to look at 7 inventions that many believe were erased from history. Some were buried under legal battles, some vanished with their creators, and some were simply dismantled and forgotten. The question is not just whether these inventions were real. The deeper question is this: if even one of them worked, who would have had the most to lose? Top 1. Water fuel cell. In 1998, in a quiet suburb of Ohio, an inventor named Stanley Meyer walked out of a restaurant during lunch, staggered across the parking lot, and collapsed. Witnesses would later recall that just before he fell, Meyer grabbed his throat and shouted words that would echo through conspiracy forums and engineering circles for decades. "They poisoned me." Minutes earlier, he had been sitting at a table with 2 Belgian investors, discussing a technology that, if true, could have rewritten the global energy economy: a car that ran on water. Stanley Meyer was not an obscure tinkerer working in isolation. Over the years, he had secured multiple patents related to a device he called the water fuel cell, a system designed to split ordinary water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then use that hydrogen as fuel inside a combustion engine. The concept of hydrogen fuel was not new. Scientists had understood for years that hydrogen could power engines. The problem was energy. Traditional electrolysis required more electricity than the hydrogen produced could deliver back. But Meyer claimed he had solved that problem. According to him, his system used a method called electrolytic dissociation, combined with a complex arrangement of pulse frequencies, resonant circuits, and specially designed electrodes. Instead of forcing water molecules apart with brute electrical force, Meyer said his device used resonance to destabilize the bonds between hydrogen and oxygen. In simple terms, the system supposedly required very little electricity to split water. If that claim was true, it would break the basic expectations of thermodynamics. And yet Meyer demonstrated it. In public tests, he installed the system on a modified dune buggy. The vehicle ran without gasoline. Observers saw it move down highways while vapor drifted quietly from the exhaust. No fuel tank, no emissions, just water. During one demonstration, Meyer reportedly turned the ignition and said calmly, "This is the fuel of the future." News outlets began covering the story. Investors became interested. Engineers and curious observers traveled to see the device in action. At one point, Meyer claimed that scientists connected to NATO had expressed interest in studying his work. There were also reports that foreign buyers attempted to purchase the technology outright, offering large sums to acquire the patents and production rights. Meyer refused. Then on that day in 1998, after a meeting with investors, he suddenly collapsed in the parking lot of the restaurant. The official cause of death was ruled a cerebral aneurysm. No toxins were found. No criminal investigation followed. But what happened next raised even more questions. After Meyer's death, the prototype vehicle disappeared. His workshop was cleared out. The development of the technology stopped completely. The patents remained publicly accessible, but engineers who later studied them discovered something unusual. Key details appeared to be missing. Critical schematics were inconsistent. Some components described in the patents did not match the devices seen in demonstrations. Others appeared intentionally altered. Researchers who attempted to replicate the system often encountered electrical failures, overheating circuits, or designs that simply would not function. Some concluded that Meyer had been mistaken, that the system required far more energy than it produced. Others believed something else entirely. They suggested that Meyer may have discovered a very narrow and unstable configuration of electrical resonance, one that worked in practice but was never fully documented. Today, decades later, the original water fuel cell has never been recovered. Its exact design remains uncertain. And the question still lingers. If Stanley Meyer truly discovered a way to power engines with nothing but water, would the world have allowed that technology to survive? Or was it simply too dangerous to exist? Top 2 EV1. In 1996, under tight security and an unusual sense of optimism, General Motors introduced a vehicle that many believed represented the future of transportation. It was called the EV1. At a time when gasoline engines dominated every road on Earth, the EV1 was something radically different. It was the world's first modern, mass-produced electric car, designed not as an experiment or prototype, but as a real consumer vehicle. It was sleek, quiet, and unlike anything most drivers had ever experienced. When people first drove the EV1, many described the sensation as almost surreal. There was no vibration from an engine, no roar when accelerating. The car simply moved forward smoothly, gliding along the road with a kind of silent precision that felt decades ahead of its time. The vehicle ran entirely on electricity, no gasoline, no exhaust, no emissions. With a range of roughly 100 miles on a single charge, the EV1 proved that electric vehicles were not just theoretical machines for the distant future. They could function in everyday life. General Motors invested heavily in the program. Charging stations were installed across parts of California and Arizona. Marketing campaigns presented the EV1 as the beginning of a new era in transportation, and people loved it. Drivers who leased the car became fiercely loyal to it. Many said they never wanted to return to gasoline vehicles again. Waiting lists began forming for additional leases, but the EV1 had one unusual rule. Customers were never allowed to buy it. Every vehicle was offered strictly through a lease agreement. Even those willing to pay the full purchase price were not given that option. At first, few people questioned this policy. Then something changed. By the end of the 1990s, rumors began circulating that General Motors had quietly lost enthusiasm for the EV1 project. Internal discussions reportedly raised concerns about the long-term impact of electric vehicles on the automotive industry. Electric cars required far fewer moving parts than gasoline vehicles. They needed no oil changes, fewer mechanical repairs, and significantly fewer replacement components. For an industry built not only on selling cars but also on servicing them for years afterward, that shift represented a serious disruption. In 2002, General Motors made a decision that shocked the EV1 community. The company began recalling every single EV1 that had been leased. Drivers were asked to return their vehicles immediately. Some refused. A few attempted to buy their cars outright, offering to pay full market value just to keep driving them. Others organized protests and demonstrations, arguing that the EV1 was working perfectly and should remain on the road. General Motors declined every offer. One by one, the vehicles were collected and transported to a fenced compound in the Arizona desert. There, most of them were destroyed. Rows of EV1s were crushed and dismantled under supervision. Only a small number survived, mostly sent to museums or universities. But even those were disabled. Their electric drivetrains were removed, ensuring they would never drive again. Officially, General Motors explained the decision by citing several reasons: battery limitations, high maintenance costs, and a supposed lack of consumer demand. But many of the people who had actually driven the EV-1 strongly disagreed. Former engineers and insiders later revealed internal documents suggesting that the cancellation of the program may have had less to do with technology and more to do with economics. Electric vehicles threatened the existing infrastructure surrounding gasoline engines, oil companies, repair networks, parts suppliers, and dealership service departments. The EV-1 did not fail because it didn't work. It disappeared because the system built around gasoline had far too much to lose. Years later, filmmaker Chris Payne would release a documentary asking a question that still echoes today. Who killed the electric car? And perhaps even more unsettling is the realization that long before modern electric vehicles filled headlines, before companies like Tesla began reshaping the market, the future had already arrived once, and then it was taken off the road. Top 3 Tesla Tower. In 1901, on a windswept stretch of land in Shoreham, New York, construction began on one of the strangest structures ever attempted in the history of science. It was not a factory, it was not a radio tower, and it was not built for war. The structure rising above the landscape was the beginning of a project that its creator believed could electrify the entire planet. The man behind it was Nikola Tesla. By the turn of the 20th century, Tesla was already famous. He had helped pioneer alternating current electricity, built revolutionary electrical systems, and demonstrated wireless transmission of energy on a small scale. But the project he now envisioned was far more ambitious than anything he had attempted before. Tesla called it the Wardenclyffe Tower. His goal was simple in concept, but breathtaking in scale. He wanted to transmit electricity wirelessly across the entire Earth. No power lines, no cables, no centralized grid. Just enormous towers sending electrical energy through the natural resonance of the planet itself. Tesla believed that the Earth could function like a giant electrical conductor. By sending powerful oscillating currents through carefully tuned coils and grounding systems, he thought it would be possible to transmit energy to receivers anywhere on the globe. A person in Europe, Africa, or Asia could theoretically receive electricity from the tower simply by using a compatible device. In Tesla's vision, power would become universally accessible. Electricity could be delivered to remote villages, ships at sea, and cities across continents without the need for wires or massive infrastructure. To begin building the project, Tesla secured funding from one of the most powerful financiers in America, J.P. Morgan. Morgan initially believed Tesla was developing a new kind of wireless communication system, something that could compete with the emerging radio technologies of the time. But as construction continued, Tesla revealed the true purpose of the tower. It would not only send signals, it would transmit free electrical power. That revelation changed everything. According to accounts from the period, Morgan asked a single question when he realized what Tesla intended. Where do we put the meter? It was a practical question, but it exposed a fundamental problem. If electricity could be transmitted freely through the air, then there would be no way to measure consumption, no way to charge customers, no way to control distribution. In other words, Tesla's system threatened the entire business model of the emerging energy industry. Shortly after that conversation, Morgan withdrew his financial support. Without funding, construction slowed. By 1905, work on the Wardenclyffe Tower had effectively stopped. The massive wooden structure remained standing for years, a silent monument to an unfinished dream. Tesla struggled to find new investors, but the project was widely considered too risky and too unconventional. Eventually, debts mounted. In 1917, the tower was demolished, reportedly sold for scrap metal. Tesla's laboratory closed, and many of his documents from that period later vanished or were scattered among various archives. Some were reportedly seized by government authorities after his death. Others were never seen again. Modern engineers who study Tesla's notes often find fragments of a system that is still difficult to fully understand. The diagrams suggest a technology far ahead of its time, one that relied not only on machinery, but also on precise electrical frequencies and planetary resonance. Whether the tower would have worked exactly as Tesla intended remains a subject of debate. But one thing is clear: if the Wardenclyffe project had succeeded, the modern world might look very different. The age of power lines, electrical grids, and energy monopolies might never have emerged. Electricity might have become something closer to air, everywhere, invisible and free. Instead, the tower disappeared, and with it vanished what may have been humanity's first real attempt to build a world powered by energy without wires. Top 4. Centennial Bulb. In a small fire station in Livermore, California, there hangs a light bulb that has been glowing almost continuously since the year 1901. It is known today as the Centennial Bulb. At first glance, it looks ordinary. A simple glass bulb with a warm amber glow, suspended quietly from the ceiling of the fire station. But the longer you look at it, the more astonishing the story becomes. This bulb has survived more than a century. It has remained lit through world wars, economic depressions, technological revolutions, and the rise and fall of entire industries. For more than 120 years, it has continued to glow. The bulb was manufactured by the Shelby Electric Company in the late 19th century. At the time, electric lighting was still a relatively new technology, and manufacturers experimented with different materials and construction methods. Unlike modern bulbs, the Centennial bulb was built using a hand-blown glass envelope and a thick carbon filament. The filament burns slowly, producing a softer light but also dramatically extending the life of the bulb. Scientists who have studied the Centennial bulb often point to that carbon filament as the key to its longevity. Modern incandescent bulbs use tungsten filaments designed to burn brighter, but also hotter, which significantly reduces their lifespan. The result is a bulb that burns out much faster. But the Centennial bulb was not unique in its era. In the early 20th century, many light bulbs lasted decades. Some remained operational for 60 years or more in factories, mines, and industrial buildings. So why did that kind of durability disappear? The answer may lie in an agreement formed in 1924, known as the Phoebus Cartel. This organization brought together some of the largest light bulb manufacturers in the world, including companies such as General Electric, Philips, and Osram. Instead of competing to produce the longest-lasting bulb, these companies reached an unusual agreement. They decided to limit the lifespan of light bulbs. Documents later uncovered revealed that the cartel established a strict standard. Bulbs should last no longer than 1,000 hours. Engineers who designed bulbs that lasted longer were penalized. Production methods were altered, and filament designs were intentionally modified to reduce durability. The goal was simple. If light bulbs burned out more often, consumers would have to buy replacements more frequently, and profits would rise. This strategy eventually became known as planned obsolescence, the deliberate design of products that fail sooner than necessary in order to sustain continuous sales. Over time, consumers forgot that light bulbs had ever been capable of lasting for decades. Factories adjusted to the new standard. Supply chains were built around it. Entire industries formed around the constant replacement of electrical goods. Meanwhile, the Centennial bulb continued to glow quietly in its fire station. Today it has its own live webcam, watched by thousands of people around the world who marvel at its endurance. But its existence raises a deeply unsettling question. If engineers once knew how to build a light bulb that could last more than a century, what else did we once know how to build? And how many of those designs were quietly abandoned, not because they failed, but because they worked too well? Top 5. Eastern Air Cleaner. In the early 1990s, in the industrial outskirts of post-Soviet Eastern Europe, a group of engineers revealed a machine that seemed almost too powerful for the world it was entering. The device was small, roughly the size of a household appliance, box-shaped, silent, and unremarkable in appearance. But according to the scientists who built it, the machine could do something extraordinary. It could clean the air completely. Not just remove dust or smoke, but eliminate toxic industrial chemicals, airborne pathogens, and microscopic pollutants that normally pass through traditional filtration systems. The prototype was developed by a team of former military engineers working near Krakow, Poland. These scientists had spent years researching advanced atmospheric purification technologies originally intended for use in contaminated environments. What they eventually produced was a device that combined cold plasma technology with a powerful electrostatic field. Most air purifiers work by trapping particles inside filters. This machine worked differently. Instead of capturing contaminants, it broke them apart at the molecular level. As polluted air passed through the chamber, electrical forces altered the charge of microscopic particles. The cold plasma field then destabilized the chemical bonds within those contaminants, effectively dismantling them without producing secondary emissions. No filters needed to be replaced, no toxic waste remained, and the device required very little electricity to operate. Independent demonstrations reportedly stunned observers. In one controlled experiment, a sealed chamber filled with hazardous chemicals such as formaldehyde and benzene was purified within 11 minutes. In another test conducted inside a polluted warehouse, the system reduced dangerous PM2.5 particles by more than 98% in under an hour. For cities struggling with smog and industrial pollution, the implications were enormous. Governments and environmental organizations initially showed strong interest. One official reportedly described the device as the most disruptive environmental technology of the decade. But within weeks, everything changed. Funding agreements were suddenly canceled. Administrative barriers appeared. Patent approvals stalled under complex regulatory reviews, and shipments containing newly built units began disappearing during transit. According to members of the development team, pressure began coming from unexpected directions. Their lead engineer was reportedly detained and questioned during a customs inspection while traveling abroad. Collaborations with research institutions were abruptly terminated. Government officials who had once supported the project stopped returning calls. By 1994, the company responsible for the technology had quietly shut down. The engineering team scattered across Europe. Some moved into unrelated industries. Others left research entirely. Years later, one former member anonymously claimed that a corporate syndicate linked to major HVAC manufacturers and chemical processing companies had purchased the remaining shares of the project through layers of shell corporations. The goal, he suggested, was not to develop the technology, but to bury it. Today, no confirmed working prototype remains in public hands. Researchers who have attempted to reconstruct the system using surviving schematics say critical information is missing, particularly the configuration of the plasma ignition chamber and the harmonic frequencies required to destabilize airborne molecules. Even more intriguing are references in some internal documents suggesting that the same technology could have been adapted for medical use. Hospitals might have used it to sterilize operating rooms. Airborne viruses could potentially have been neutralized before they spread. Entire buildings might have been protected from biological contamination. But none of those applications were ever explored. Instead, the device disappeared. And in a world still struggling with smog-filled cities, respiratory illness, and airborne pandemics, its absence feels less like a forgotten invention and more like something that was deliberately erased. Because if a machine once existed that could clean the air completely, then someone, somewhere, decided the world would never get to use it. Top 6. Vacuum engine. In 1983, in a quiet suburb of Toronto, Canada, an independent engineer named Troy Hurtubise began talking about a machine that many scientists considered impossible. According to Hurtubise, he had built a small engine capable of producing continuous motion without fuel, electricity, or combustion. The device was about the size of a shoebox. Inside it were copper coils, magnets, and several titanium plates, arranged in a configuration that looked more like an experimental physics project than a conventional engine. When activated, the machine reportedly emitted a low humming sound and began turning a connected flywheel. And once it started, it didn't stop. There was no visible energy source, no batteries, no external power supply. Yet the flywheel continued to rotate, steadily and continuously. Hurtubise claimed the machine worked by manipulating vacuum pressure and magnetic fields. According to his explanation, the device created a special chamber where opposing magnetic forces generated a constant pressure imbalance, tapping into what he believed was a form of background energy present in empty space. Physicists sometimes refer to this concept as vacuum energy, the theoretical energy that exists even in the absence of matter. Hurtubise believed his engine was able to harness that energy and convert it into mechanical motion. To many scientists, the idea sounded absurd. The laws of thermodynamics state that energy cannot be created from nothing. A machine that produced power without consuming fuel would violate one of the most fundamental principles of physics. But Hurtubise insisted that the device was not creating energy. It was simply extracting energy from an overlooked natural source. Curious journalists and independent engineers were invited to witness demonstrations. According to several accounts, the machine appeared to function exactly as her device described. The flywheel rotated smoothly. No power cables were connected. Observers reportedly examined the device closely, trying to determine whether hidden batteries or concealed wiring were responsible for the motion. Nothing obvious was found. Then, not long after those demonstrations, something strange happened. Tivessem later claimed that several unidentified officials visited him at his workshop. He described them simply as men in suits. They questioned him about the origin of his materials, the purpose of the machine, and whether he intended to patent or sell the technology. The conversation reportedly left him uneasy. About a week later, disaster struck. His workshop caught fire. The blaze destroyed the building completely. Investigators ruled the incident an electrical fire, despite the fact that the workshop reportedly had no active connection to the power grid at the time. Everything inside the building was lost. The prototype engine was reduced to ashes. Tivessem attempted to rebuild the device from memory, but he later reported a series of disturbing incidents. Equipment shipments were delayed or lost. Tools were vandalized. Surveillance vehicles appeared outside his property. Gradually, he withdrew from public discussion about the engine. In later years, Tivessem returned to invention, creating several unusual projects including experimental armor systems and electromagnetic devices, but he never again spoke in detail about the vacuum energy engine. Skeptics dismiss the entire story as pseudoscience, an ambitious inventor chasing an impossible dream. Yet others remain fascinated by the consistency of the early witness reports and the strange timing of the fire that destroyed the only known prototype. If the machine truly worked, even briefly, its implications would have been staggering. An engine that produced energy without fuel would have rewritten the rules of power generation. No oil, no coal, no infrastructure. Just a machine drawing energy from the fabric of space itself. But the engine vanished before it could ever be properly studied. And like so many inventions before it, the world was left with nothing but the question, was the vacuum energy engine impossible? Or did it simply threaten a world that depended on energy being scarce? Top 7. Infinite battery. In 1973, a retired aerospace engineer named Carl Cordish quietly revealed a battery that, if developed to its full potential, could have transformed the entire electronics industry. Cordish was not an unknown figure in the world of energy technology. During his career, he had been involved in the development of early alkaline battery systems and had contributed to research connected with NASA fuel cell programs. His work had already influenced power systems used in satellites and military communications. But the invention he presented in the early 1970s was something far more radical. It was a battery designed to last up to 50 years. Unlike conventional batteries, which slowly degrade with every charge and discharge cycle, Cordish's design combined two different technologies: the chemical stability of alkaline manganese dioxide batteries and the regenerative capabilities of a hydrogen fuel cell system. The result was a hybrid power unit capable of continuously producing electricity while simultaneously regenerating its internal chemical components. In simple terms, the battery could recharge itself while operating. Once activated, the system used hydrogen reactions to restore the energy potential of the alkaline cell. Because the chemical cycle continuously renewed itself, the battery could theoretically run for decades without replacement. For military and aerospace applications, the implications were enormous. Satellites could operate for far longer periods without needing replacement power sources. Remote communication equipment could run for years in isolated locations. Even consumer electronics, if adapted to the design, might operate for decades without a new battery. And the materials used were surprisingly ordinary. Unlike modern lithium-ion batteries, which depend on rare metals and complex manufacturing processes, Cordish's design relied on relatively common chemical components and a simple closed-loop system. The battery was also extremely durable. It functioned in extreme temperatures. It generated stable electrical output. And because it produced energy even while idle, it could maintain long-term systems without interruption. When Cordish presented the technology to potential partners in industry and government, initial reactions were polite but strangely cautious. Some engineers were impressed. Others were skeptical. But the most revealing response reportedly came from a representative of a major electronics manufacturer who examined the design and then made a blunt observation. This battery would last longer than any product we sell. For companies whose business models depended on products being replaced regularly, that was not good news. A battery that lasted half a century would eliminate a massive portion of the global battery market. Portable electronics, vehicles, and countless consumer devices would no longer require constant replacement power cells. Despite its promise, the project failed to gain serious industrial backing. Licensing deals never materialized. Government research contracts quietly disappeared. Kodesh attempted to secure patents for the full regenerative system, but parts of the design stalled during the approval process due to claims that it lacked sufficient commercial applicability. In other words, it was too durable to fit the market. Nearly a decade later, in 1982, a private investor attempted to revive the project by forming a startup company dedicated to producing the long-life battery. The concept was simple: a power source that could last an entire lifetime. Within 6 months, the company collapsed. No large-scale production ever began. The remaining prototypes, stored for testing, were later seized during a regulatory compliance review and were never returned. Over time, Kodesh's design faded into obscurity. Meanwhile, modern battery technology followed a very different path. Lithium-ion cells became the dominant power source for phones, laptops, electric vehicles, and power tools. But these batteries have a limited lifespan, gradually degrading after hundreds or thousands of charge cycles. Eventually, they must be replaced. And every year, millions of discarded batteries contribute to growing mountains of electronic waste. Yet decades earlier, there had once been a design that promised something entirely different. A battery that could run for 50 years. A battery that might have powered devices for an entire generation without ever needing replacement. If Carl Kodesh's invention had succeeded, the cycle of constant charging, replacing, and discarding batteries might never have existed. But the technology never reached the market. And like so many of the inventions before it, the question remains: did the infinite battery fail because it was impractical? Or because a world built on constant replacement simply could not afford to let it succeed? Top 8 Magnet Motor. In the late 1970s, an American physicist named Howard Johnson made a claim so controversial that many scientists refused to even discuss it. He said he had built a motor that could run without fuel, without electricity, and without combustion. The device relied entirely on permanent magnets. At first glance, the idea sounded impossible. Physics teaches that magnets can exert forces on each other, but those forces normally balance out. Once motion begins, friction and resistance eventually slow everything down. But Johnson believed something had been overlooked. After years of experimenting with magnetic fields, he claimed that magnets could be arranged in a precise geometry that would create a continuous chain of repulsive forces, pushing a rotor forward again and again without requiring additional energy. In simple terms, the motor would continue spinning once it started. No fuel, no wires, just the invisible forces stored inside magnetic fields. In 1980, Johnson submitted his invention to the United States Patent Office. To the surprise of many critics, the patent was actually granted. It became U.S. Patent 431 Permanent Magnet Motor. For supporters of Johnson's work, this was extraordinary. The U.S. Patent Office does not usually approve technologies that violate established physical laws. Examiners typically require working demonstrations and technical explanations before approving such claims. Yet Johnson's design passed through the system. His motor used a carefully arranged set of curved magnets along a stationary outer ring, known as the stator, interacting with magnets placed on a rotating inner wheel called the rotor. As the magnets moved past each other, they generated a sequence of repelling forces that pushed the rotor forward in a continuous cycle. Johnson argued that the motor was not creating energy from nothing. Instead, it was releasing potential energy stored in the magnetic fields themselves. He demonstrated the device privately to several journalists, engineers, and investors. According to those who attended the demonstrations, the motor appeared to rotate continuously once set in motion. But the reaction from the scientific community was swift and overwhelmingly skeptical. Many physicists insisted the concept violated the second law of thermodynamics, which states that systems naturally lose energy over time due to entropy. Major scientific journals refused to publish Johnson's research. Universities declined to replicate the experiments. Researchers who attempted to recreate the design often reported strange problems. Some claimed their prototypes simply failed to work. Others described unpredictable behavior, magnets losing strength unexpectedly, or motion becoming unstable. Supporters of Johnson argued that the device required extremely precise alignment and specialized materials that were not easily reproduced. But as interest in the invention grew, Johnson reportedly began facing increasing pressure. Legal challenges emerged over the scope of his patent. Companies that initially expressed interest in licensing the technology suddenly withdrew from negotiations. One collaborator later claimed that offers had been made to purchase the patent outright for the purpose of removing it from circulation. Johnson refused to sell. Over the following years, funding for the project slowly disappeared. Without financial backing, development stalled. By the late 1980s, Johnson had largely withdrawn from public discussion of the motor. In one of his final recorded comments on the subject, he reportedly said something that captured the quiet frustration of his struggle. "They didn't have to prove me wrong. They just had to outlast me." Howard Johnson died in 2008. His magnetic motor was never produced commercially. Today, the idea of a permanent magnet motor remains controversial. Some scientists dismiss it entirely as pseudoscience, while others continue to study the possibility that magnetic fields may contain forms of usable energy not yet fully understood. But one fact remains undeniable. The patent exists, and for a brief moment in history, a machine was demonstrated that appeared to run on nothing more than the silent forces locked inside magnets. If Johnson had truly discovered a way to harness that energy, it might have unlocked one of the most powerful and overlooked sources of motion ever known. Top 9 Trash Fuel Converter. In 2003, inside an unremarkable warehouse on the outskirts of São Paulo, Brazil, a small team of engineers unveiled a machine they believed could solve two of the world's most persistent crises at the same time: energy shortages and mountains of garbage. Their invention was not glamorous. It did not look futuristic. The device resembled a large industrial container, roughly the size of a shipping crate, connected to a series of pipes, pressure chambers, and catalytic processing units. But what it was capable of doing was extraordinary. The machine could convert ordinary household trash into usable fuel: plastic bottles, food waste, old shoes, packaging, organic scraps. Almost any form of garbage could be fed into the system, and what came out the other side was a clear liquid fuel chemically similar to gasoline. The engineers called their project Project Gaia. The core of the system was based on a process known as thermal depolymerization, enhanced with proprietary catalysts and high-pressure reaction chambers. Instead of simply burning waste like an incinerator, the machine broke complex materials down at the molecular level. Long carbon chains found in plastics and organic materials were separated and then rearranged into simpler hydrocarbons. In other words, the system effectively reversed the process that originally created fossil fuels. Garbage went in, fuel came out, and according to the engineers behind the device, the conversion efficiency exceeded 80%. Even more impressive, the process produced almost no toxic emissions. Unlike traditional waste incineration, which releases harmful gases and pollutants into the atmosphere, the Gaia system operated inside sealed chambers that captured and reused most byproducts. Early demonstrations drew attention from environmental groups, local politicians, and international media outlets. In one widely reported test, fuel produced by the machine powered a diesel generator continuously for 48 hours using nothing but processed household waste. Another demonstration produced a fuel so clean that it exceeded Brazil's regulatory standards for commercial gasoline. For cities drowning in landfills, the implications were enormous. Waste could become energy, landfills could shrink dramatically, and countries dependent on imported oil might suddenly gain access to a domestic fuel source generated from their own trash. For a brief moment, it looked as if the technology might spread. Then everything stopped. Only weeks after a televised news segment introduced Project Gaia to the public, the facility where the prototype was located was suddenly raided by authorities. Officials cited violations related to environmental processing licenses. The machinery was confiscated for inspection. Permits were suspended. No criminal charges were filed, but the project was shut down immediately. The engineers behind Gaia disappeared from public view. One reportedly relocated to Uruguay. Another later resurfaced, working in the software industry. Requests for interviews were declined. Attempts by journalists to locate the confiscated prototype led to a maze of bureaucratic responses and heavily redacted documents. Years later, a Freedom of Information request submitted by an investigative reporter uncovered internal communications between regulatory agencies and private energy companies. One memo warned of disruptive fuel synthesis technologies that could threaten existing refining infrastructure. Another document suggested containment strategies for technologies that bypass traditional oil production systems. Officially, there was never confirmation that these discussions were connected to Project Gaia. But the timing raised troubling questions. Today, the global waste crisis has only grown worse. Landfills continue to expand. Plastic pollution spreads through oceans. Energy prices fluctuate across international markets. And yet, very few people remember the Brazilian machine that once promised to turn trash into fuel. Skeptics argue that scaling the technology might have revealed hidden problems, unstable reactions, emissions risks, or economic barriers that made large-scale deployment impractical. But without access to the original prototype or full technical documentation, those questions remain unanswered. Because the machine disappeared before anyone outside that warehouse had the chance to truly examine it. And if a system once existed that could transform the world's garbage into clean energy, then someone, somewhere decided that discovery would never leave the building. Top 10 Neuroscope. In 2009, inside a modest biomedical research lab in Geneva, Switzerland, a team of engineers developed a device that seemed to reach far beyond the limits of conventional medicine. It was small, compact enough to sit on a tabletop, roughly the size of a shoebox. And according to the researchers behind it, this machine could detect serious illness before symptoms appeared. The device was called the Neuroscope. Unlike traditional medical diagnostics, it did not rely on blood samples, X-rays, biopsies, or MRI scans. Instead, the Neuroscope was designed to analyze the body's electromagnetic field, scanning for subtle irregularities believed to reflect changes in cellular health. The theory behind it was controversial, but not entirely new. For decades, fringe researchers and a handful of biomedical theorists had suggested that the human body produces a unique electromagnetic signature, shaped by its internal biological processes. Every organ, every neural pathway, and every chemical reaction generates electrical activity. The team behind the Neuroscope believed that illness altered those patterns long before visible symptoms emerged. Cancer, neurological disorders, degenerative disease, chronic inflammatory conditions. All of them, according to the project's designers, created measurable distortions in the body's natural electromagnetic harmonics. The Neuroscope was built to detect those distortions. Using ultra-sensitive sensors, biofeedback analysis, and an early form of machine learning pattern recognition, the device compared a person's electromagnetic readings to an expanding database of disease markers. The results from early tests were astonishing. In clinical trials involving terminally ill patients, the device reportedly identified signs of malignant growth weeks, and in some cases months, before they appeared on imaging scans. It also detected early-stage neurological decline linked to Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's, identifying subtle changes in neural resonance before formal diagnoses had been made. In controlled environments, the Neuroscope even flagged chronic conditions in test subjects who had no idea they were already ill. If the technology had worked exactly as described, it would have changed medicine forever. Diseases could be discovered before symptoms emerge, treatment could begin earlier, hospitals could move from reaction to prevention, and one of the most profitable sectors of modern healthcare, late-stage diagnostics, might have been fundamentally disrupted. At first, the project attracted quiet but serious interest. Hospitals in Switzerland and Germany reportedly requested pilot units. International health organizations took notice, and according to one account, a pharmaceutical executive who witnessed a demonstration responded with a question that captured the threat the device represented. If this works, why would anyone need routine screenings? That question, some believe, marked the beginning of the end. Within weeks, the company's research license was suddenly suspended. Officials cited data irregularities and concerns about medical reliability. The lab's servers were seized, manufacturing contracts were voided, and the lead engineer, a Romanian national working with the team, was deported over alleged visa violations. Publicly, the explanation was simple. The technology had not met required standards for medical accuracy, but no comprehensive public rebuttal of the device's performance was ever released. No large-scale independent review was made available. No final scientific paper fully discrediting the project ever appeared. The neuroscope simply vanished. Attempts to revive the technology through private funding failed. The rights to the core system were later acquired by a shell corporation and then left inactive. Researchers who tried to reconstruct the device from scattered open-source fragments reported missing calibration data, incomplete sensor architecture, and critical gaps in the signal processing model. Some believe those omissions were intentional. Others claim a working version of the device still exists, used quietly in restricted medical facilities far from public scrutiny. Whether that is true remains impossible to verify. But the implications of the neuroscope continue to haunt the story. Because if a machine once existed that could detect disease before conventional medicine could even see it, then it was not merely a diagnostic device. It was a challenge to an entire system built around waiting until illness becomes visible, measurable, and billable. And perhaps that was the real danger. Not that the machine failed, but that it threatened to change the business of medicine itself. When we look at each of these inventions individually, they might seem like isolated stories. A strange engine here, an unusual battery there, a forgotten tower built by a brilliant inventor more than a century ago. But when we place them side by side, a pattern begins to emerge. Across different countries, different industries, and different decades, the same sequence appears again and again. First comes the breakthrough. An inventor creates something that appears to challenge the limits of what technology should be able to do. Demonstrations attract attention. Engineers, investors, and curious observers gather to witness the possibility of a completely new future. For a brief moment, it feels as if the world is standing on the edge of transformation. Then the resistance begins. Funding disappears. Patents stall in endless legal complications. Laboratories are closed. Equipment vanishes. Sometimes the inventors themselves fade into obscurity, their work unfinished and their discoveries never fully understood. Official explanations are always offered. Technical problems, financial difficulties, lack of demand. But the deeper question remains. What happens when a technology threatens not just a single company, but an entire economic system? A car that runs on water would shake the foundations of the global oil industry. Wireless electricity would undermine centralized power grids worth trillions of dollars. A battery that lasts half a century would destroy entire markets built on constant replacement. And a machine capable of cleaning the air completely could transform industries tied to pollution control and chemical processing. In each case, the invention does more than solve a problem. It disrupts the structure of power itself. Throughout history, progress has often been shaped not only by what humanity is capable of creating, but also by what powerful institutions are willing to allow. Technologies that fit existing systems move forward. Technologies that threaten them often disappear. The inventions we have explored tonight may represent only a small fragment of a much larger story. Hidden behind patents that were quietly buried, prototypes that were dismantled, and research that was never allowed to continue. Perhaps some of these devices never truly worked. Perhaps some were misunderstood or exaggerated. But if even one of them had succeeded, the world we live in today might look completely different. Energy might be abundant. Pollution might be drastically reduced. Devices might last for generations instead of years. And entire industries might never have formed in the first place. The tragedy of these stories is not that the inventors failed. The tragedy is that some of them may have succeeded. And that success may have been the very reason their inventions vanished. Because sometimes the most dangerous discovery is not the one that breaks the laws of nature. It is the one that breaks the rules of profit. And if history has shown us anything, it is that the future is not always decided by the best idea. Sometimes it is decided by who stands to lose the most if that idea becomes real.